You're listening to episode 42 of the Fed and Fearless podcast. On today's episode, I'm talking with Dr. George Yancey about how conservative Christians can approach anti-racism without giving up their values. So stay tuned. Hi, I'm Laura Schoenfeld. I'm a registered dietitian and coach trained in functional medicine with a passion for helping women just like you ditch perfectionism and use food, fitness, and self-care to fuel your bigger God-given purpose. I believe that it's possible to achieve your biggest life-changing goals without the frustration, obsession, or negative self-talk that so many women subject themselves to every day. All you need are the right tools, the right mindset, and the faith to turn your dreams into reality. I'm here to guide you along the way. The truth is that you are so much more than a body, and I'm on a mission to help you change the way you think and act at a core beliefs level so you can transform your physical, mental, and spiritual health from the inside out. Are you ready to become fed and fearless in your pursuit of a healthy, meaningful life? Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Fed and Fearless podcast. I'm Laura Schoenfeld. I'm your host as always, and I have a very interesting and different podcast episode for you today than the stuff that we're normally talking about. I mentioned on a previous episode a couple of weeks ago how one of the ways that I am responding to everything that's going on in the world today around racism and racial injustices, the way that I'm responding is by getting more diversity on this platform. It's something that I wasn't really paying attention to when I first launched the podcast last fall. I was mostly just thinking about who I'm friends with, who could I ask to come on the show, who would be someone that talks about a topic that I feel like I have interest in and that I hope you guys have interest in. And what that ended up looking like is that a large majority of my audience, or I'm sorry, not my audience, my interviewees were white women, which again, not apologizing for that. That was something that was an oversight. And it just happens to be that a lot of the women that I interact with in the community are white. It's not on purpose, but it was something that was brought to my attention in the last few months. So I decided that, again, one thing that I could do to help break down racism in my world is to start purposefully seeking out more diversity on my podcast, whether that's diversity of race, diversity of gender, diversity of religious background. You know, everything that I do is with the goal of helping people understand their bodies and their value in the eyes of God. And God has created all people. So I want to bring on different people onto the show that have different perspectives and different ways of looking at things than I do so that we can have a more diverse approach to the various things that are affecting all of us on a day-to-day basis. And of course, the racism question has been something that has really been a big topic of conversation in the last couple months. This isn't a new topic. Of course, racism has been an issue in our country since the day that our country was formed. So it's not like this is something that all of a sudden just became a problem in 2020. But the last couple of months, it's been something that has come to the forefront as a national conversation. And there is a lot of back and forth about what's the best way to handle this and who's got the right perspective and who's allowed to talk about it, that kind of thing. For me, it's been somewhat eye-opening. It's been good for me to start looking at the stuff with more interest and more focus. I tend to be someone who, when I get into my own world of doing what I'm doing, I don't really pay attention to always what's going on in the world around me. There's pros and cons to that. The pro is that I can focus and I can stay focused on the things that are really important to me, my family, my clients, the world that I'm in. Just trying to do my best to serve you all and to create content that helps. And by doing that, I do unfortunately put some blinders on to some other stuff going on that is outside of my experience. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to be ignoring other people's challenges, other people's perspectives or anything like that. And that's why with my podcast, my goal is to bring on a bigger diversity of people. So all of that said, the reason I bring this up for this particular conversation is because I don't think I would have ever seen myself interviewing this particular guest, just because I don't bring a lot of professors onto my show. Maybe I need to do that more often. But it's not someone that necessarily, certainly they're not in the health world. They're not in the nutrition space. They're not in the online marketing space, anything like that. So this particular interview today is with someone who, if you had asked me 6 months ago if I thought I'd ever interview this person, I would have been like, why would I have them on the show? But I just feel like this person, when I was exposed to them and their work and the book that they wrote, I read his book in about an afternoon, I think. Maybe it was 2 different afternoons to finish the whole thing. But I just really ate up the stuff that I was reading from him because it was such a unique perspective and such a different way of looking at things that I don't feel is very well represented in mainstream media or social media today. So all of that said, I'm super pumped about this. This interview is very interesting, very different than our normal interviews. And it really is just scratching the surface of a really huge topic, which is racism and how Christians can really help address racism and racial injustice in a post-Christian world. Very specific topic, but I'm super excited about it because it's a really good conversation, and I'm hoping that you will have a different perspective coming out of this, and I hope that you will read this person's work because it's very eye-opening and very well written and very applicable to the stuff that's going on today. So I keep saying this person. I know that I do this a lot, but I'm very excited to have with me on today's show Dr. George Yancey. Dr. Yancey is a professor of the Institute for Studies of Religion and Sociology at Baylor University. He has published several research articles on the topics of institutional racial diversity, racial identity, atheists, cultural progressives, academic bias, and anti-Christian hostility. His books include Compromising Scholarship, a book that explores religious and political biases in academia; So Many Christians, So Few Lions, a book that addresses Christianophobia in the United States; Beyond Racial Gridlock, a Christian book which articulates a mutual obligations approach to racial issues; and with Michael Emerson, Transcending Racial Barriers, an academic book that articulates a mutual obligations approach. He's currently working on research contrasting conservative and progressive Christians. So from that bio, you can tell that this is someone who has a really interesting perspective, and a perspective that probably doesn't fit the boxes that, the political identities or the faith identities, the kind of things that we like to box ourselves into in the United States. He doesn't fit into those boxes. And I don't think I fit into those boxes either. And before we jumped on the recording, we were kind of joking that we're both okay with triggering people and having uncomfortable conversations. And that is the reason why I was super excited to have Dr. Yancey on. Because again, I think having uncomfortable conversations, having conversations with people that think differently than you is the way that we learn and grow and get to have a more open-minded, but also informed perspective about the way we see the world and about the way that we practice our Christianity and the way that we practically follow Jesus. So that's really what we're talking about today in this interview. It was really interesting, really different, and something that I don't know if you're going to hear in a lot of other places. I hope people will have Dr. Yancey on, but unfortunately, things like being moderate or seeing different sides of the equation, or, being a Christian, but not being either like super liberal or super conservative, that stuff doesn't tend to be as attractive to things like the media these days. So I hope that Dr. Yancey will be invited onto even bigger platforms than mine, but I'm just grateful to have him on my platform, and I hope that you will enjoy our conversation. So without further ado, here is Dr. George Yancey. All right, everybody. I am very excited to have with me today someone that I don't know if I would have ever expected inviting on as a guest in the original development of this podcast. I think I was thinking, we're going to talk about health, nutrition, that kind of thing. And with everything that's been going on in the last few months, I realized that I wanted to bring on a person who I feel like has a really awesome perspective on racism in the United States from a Christian perspective, which I feel like is a little challenging to find these days. So when I found this person, saw the book that they had written, I was like, this is someone that I want to bring on the show. So luckily, this person was very gracious to come on, and I'm super pumped to have him here. So welcome to the show, Dr. George Yancey.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
So, like I said, this is going to be a topic that I never thought I'd be talking about on the podcast, but I'm glad we are, and I'm glad that you're here chatting about it. So the first question that I would like to ask you is, do you believe that racism, especially systemic racism, is still a big issue in our country today, and why or why not?
Yes. I mean, I studied the subject. And so, it's easy when you study the subject, you get so immersed in it, that's all you see. And so it's really clear for me to see systematic racism everywhere. I'm not saying it's the biggest problem in the country, but it's still a problem in our country. When I talk about this in my class, I teach race ethnicity on college campuses. I like to give examples because when we just say systematic racism, what does that mean? And so if you go back to, say, the 1950s and you talk about Jim Crow, we talk about institutional racism, the point I make on that is, and I assume most people know what Jim Crow is, separate but equal, that sort of stuff. What happens is, if you're in that system, it does not matter whether or not you are personally racist or not. So if you're in a system where blacks can't eat at the lunch counter, you could be the least racist person there is, but you're a waiter or waitress, you're still reinforcing systematic racism. So that's hard clear. So we don't have that today. We have other mechanisms where it doesn't matter whether or not you're personally racist or not. The effect of it has an impact on people of color. I'll just use immigration as an example. The way we do immigration tends to, we're much more suspicious of people from countries to our south than to our north. And so if you're enforcing immigration rules, and you could be the least racist person there is, you can say, I love all people, and that can be true. But you tend to enforce rules that disproportionately impact the Latinx population, as opposed to the Canadian population. Well, that is a type of systematic racism. And so I just want to, clarify that term, because people hear racism and they think Ku Klux Klan, and thus I'm not Ku Klux Klan, therefore it's not an issue. And you don't have to have racism in your heart for it to be a problem in our society. And so we have to look at the mechanisms we have in our society that would help inform us whether or not this has what we call a disparate impact on people of color, and whether or not that disparate impact is warranted or not. I'll give you an example of one where it probably is warranted. There are certain crimes in which people of color commit more than other people. But we don't want to get rid of the law against those crimes. Now, we may look at the punishments, we look at things like that, but if someone comes up with some sort of statistical analysis that shows that African Americans commit murder at higher rates than white Americans, I am not going to advocate for a law to abolish, the law against murder. Obviously, I want to make sure everything is fair, but so there may be a reason why there's just an impact, but we really want to make sure that reason is sound and valid, and a lot of times it's not.
Mm-hmm. Do you have some other concrete examples that you can share that just to open the eyes of our listeners to some of those things that are still happening? Since you mentioned the Jim Crow laws, and, if we go back into history, we can see very clearly, yes, that was a racist system. I think nowadays people struggle a little bit more to understand, like, where is the racism still happening in our system that needs to be addressed?
There's a couple of studies out there that I think kind of illustrate this fairly well. There was what we call a meta-analysis, which means they took a lot of studies and just looked at all the results. And they looked at these studies that were looking at what they call callback audits. So what they do is they would subscribe to get a job, and they would put their race down or name the indicated race, and then see if they get callbacks. And what's pretty clear, and remember, this is a meta-analysis, so it's not a single study. This is a lot of studies, the effect of it. It's pretty clear that if you're an African-American, very clear you're African-American, a little less clear you're Hispanic American, but still there, you're getting less fewer callbacks. Well, why is that? I mean, we have evidence about stereotypes. We have evidence about, the assumptions people make. That is a way in which racism interacts. There's driving while black. once again, the studies are pretty clear that if you are an African American and you're driving in your car, you're more likely to be pulled over than if you're a European American driving in your car. And they've done research where they've looked at the racial composition of people who drive a certain way and how many people get pulled over and things of this nature. And there's no evidence that blacks speed any more than anyone else or anything like that. So, this is more evidence that despite what people want to believe, and I understand why we want to believe it, and I admit we've gotten better. So I'm not one of these people who say it's like slavery. It's not. But we still have problems with race. It still impacts us in our society in very negative ways. And I'll just close with this because this is research I actually did myself. And I know it's a little dated, but I suspect it's still true. I think it's about 10, 12 years ago, I was doing research on interracial dating. And I think it was Yahoo. Yahoo used to use personal advertisements where you can, single white male, da-da-da. And what I found was that, I found that African Americans were the least desired group to date. But what was interesting was the result among Christians, because it had where you could label who you wanted to date and who you were. So you could say, I want to date someone who is this race, this religion, this what have you. I found among Christians, especially white Christians, they're more willing to date someone outside their own religion than outside their own race. And less willing to date, say, an African American than they were to date a Jewish American. Now, to me, as a Christian, I was always taught date inside your faith. No one ever explicitly taught me date only African Americans. And yet somehow people are getting this message, and Christians, when they actually go on these dating advertisements, are more likely to exclude someone because of their race than of their faith. To me, that indicates that this is not just a problem outside the church, but it's a problem in the church as well.
That's really interesting. I did online dating and I'm trying to think, I would have not expected that. I feel like I would have expected the opposite. So I appreciate that example.
I thought the opposite would happen too, because of all the teaching I got as a Christian. But
yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that I think I believed about online dating, if I had followed those rules, I wouldn't have actually even found my husband. So I feel like putting barriers on any sort of dating is not usually going to lead to great things. So now that we know that there is for sure systemic racism that still exists, maybe not as obvious as it was, 50, 100 years ago, but it's still there. I'd like to talk a little bit about the term white privilege, because that is a word that is being used a lot lately. And I know that there's some people who strongly from all races are very opposed to using that term. And then there's also a lot of people who feel like that term must be part of our language and must be a conversation that we're having no matter what race we are. So how would you define white privilege? And do you agree with using this term when we're discussing modern racism?
White privilege, of course, was a term that was popularized by Peggy McIntosh. And basically, in a very famous article, she said she was a woman. I think she was women's studies. And she says, I talk about male privilege, but I'm white. So what's my white privilege? She lists about 50 different things about what white privilege is. And things such as, I can go into a group and I can act, I can smell, or I can act rude, or I can do all these things. And no one will attribute it to my race. They'll just see me as it. I don't have to speak for my race. If I get pulled over by the cops, I don't have to wonder whether or not my race played a role in this. I can go to stores and not wonder if I'm being suspicious that's because of my race. Things like this. And so the way she defines it, which I accept her definition, is, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it's this unearned knapsack of privileges that whites carry about that they don't often realize that they have. And they don't realize they have it because they've not been in the other places. I'll give you something from when I was younger. And I don't know if this still happens. When I was younger and looked healthier and faster and stronger, I used to hear car doors locks when they drove past me. So cars drive past me and they had these electronic locks. And you just hear, and I thought, wow. And I actually thought at first that, I'm a young male and that's it. But I talked to my white friends, they never heard it. I talked to my black male friends, they heard it. So a privilege is that you're not seen with the sort of suspicion as you are if you're an African American. You don't have to worry about car doors locking on you. Now that sounds like, that's not a big deal, except that I internalize that. and know that, okay, people don't trust me quite. I have to earn your trust a little bit more because I'm an African American. I don't hear him anymore because I guess they see an old guy and think he's not fast, so I don't have to worry about it. I don't know. But I don't hear him anymore, but I used to hear him when I was younger. Well, that's white privilege. I think it's a valid concept. I think the concept can be misused. I think it can be used to stop conversations rather than encourage them. And the way it can be taught can be very problematic too. So I'm not saying that, just because I think it's a valid concept that it can't be misused, because it can be misused. But I would agree that there is this sort of invisible knapsack of privileges that whites have that is not always recognized by them. And that's part of the problem we have in understanding each other, is that whites have these privileges. People of color don't have those exact privileges. And so when people of color talk about these advantages, whites say, I don't see anything. And one understands why they may say that, but those privileges are there. So yeah, I that's a concept that I would validate.
Okay. Yeah. And it's interesting because in the last few months, have been just looking for lots of different opinions. I'm one of those type of people that wants to kind of hear from different sides of the equation and thinking, well, this person says this thing, what does somebody else say about this? And trying to hear lots of different perspectives. What do you think about, there are some conservative Black voices out there that suggest discussing white privilege is creating this belief of Black inferiority. What would you say to someone who makes that argument?
I'm not really seeing a lot of evidence that that's the case. I think that there's probably some isolated cases where that's true, but I've not seen any evidence where that's been a problem. But to be honest, I will tell you where there has been evidence that talking about white privilege can be a problem, and that is in our attitudes towards poor whites. Because there's some research out there that shows that when you bring white privilege into training sessions, what happens is not that people become more sympathetic to African Americans, but less sympathetic to poor whites, because they go, well, you had all these privileges and you're still poor. And so that's why I'm saying that, it can be problematic the way that we present it. And I think we have to be more careful in how we present it. But as far as Black inferiority, I don't think that is, I haven't seen any evidence. I mean, if there's evidence, as a scholar, I go where the evidence goes. And if there's evidence, then I will say, yeah, this is an issue. But until I see the evidence, I don't accept it.
Gotcha. And this was a term that I I had used a couple weeks ago when discussing some of the ways that in the world of nutrition and public health, the government has come into various communities of different ethnicities, different socioeconomic statuses, and told them to eat a certain way. One of my experiences was actually visiting an Apache reservation in Arizona. I think that this was almost 10 years, probably more than 10 years ago at this point. And one of the things I learned was that the government actually came in and made it illegal for them to hunt or to gather their own food. And they were forced to eat government rations as a diet. So maybe this was a little bit of an inflammatory way to describe this, but I suggested that, some of the nutrition guidelines and the nutrition practices from the government over the last 50 plus years actually have some white supremacy in it, where I was defining white supremacy as white people's practices are better than other races, and that those were the practices that people of color needed to take on. So I might have been misinterpreting the word white supremacy. I've also heard the term white hegemony as a way to describe that. How would you describe or define white supremacy? And is it just things like the KKK, or is there stuff that we need to be watching for outside of that more overt racism?
Well, let me suggest that probably what you were really describing was Anglo conformity. That's probably a more accurate description, Anglo conformity, where we were talking about trying to conform to an Anglo-Saxon culture. And you probably are somewhat aware of the real history behind that with Native Americans. I don't know if you've heard the saying, kill the Indian, save the man. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but what was done on reservations, kids in boarding schools, or Indians were taken boarding schools, and their culture was basically killed out of them. So you did tap into a longstanding hostility, racism against Native Americans. There's no doubt about that. And to be honest, probably at least early on in our country, white supremacy would have been a pretty accurate way of describing it. I would use Anglo conformity today, though. I guess, well, here's my thinking. I think we need to make sure our terms mean what we want them to mean. White supremacy arose in large part in reaction to the transatlantic slave trade, when there was a need to create well, I don't want to go too professor on you anyways, but basically what happened was when we first had blacks as slaves, they weren't slaves, they were indentured servants. You know, white indentured servants. And they were serving long time together. Okay. So there developed a need to separate them out because white indentured servants came from Europe, and if you enslaved them for life, there was recourses back in Europe, and then all sorts of problems would have happened. The black indentured servants came from Africa, and because of what was happening over in Africa and some of the collapsing empires, they didn't have much recourses. So there was an interest in making the black slaves realize, but how do you do that and justify it when you also have these white indentured servants? Well, out of that began to arose. I'm not saying people went to some sort of smoke-filled back room and planned this out. It just happened. The notion of whites being superior to other races began to develop. Whites being intellectually and physically, and white supremacy was really seeing blacks and eventually other groups as subhumans. They're not fully humans. A lot of the evolutionary theory was tied to this. Some Christianity got dragged into this. And so that's what white supremacy emerged from. I say that to say that's what white supremacy means in a technical sense. When we expand it to mean other things, what happens is, is that saying, if everything is racism, then nothing is racism. If everything's white supremacy, then nothing is white supremacy. And so I probably wouldn't use white supremacy for that situation. I think Anglo conformity, I think I can make the argument that Anglo conformity is bad enough without going to white supremacy, And so that's probably where I would go, because I think that's a more accurate term of what's happening. And there's a lot of our history of Anglo conformity as well that we can tap into. And I would agree with you that, that not allowing Native Americans to create their own diets, and you're the expert on diet much more than I am, obviously. And so, I would agree that there could be things in their diet that's not good for them, but generally speaking, we should try to do that without our cultural lenses, and so I think that you would be very careful about not allowing them to contribute to their diet in a culturally appropriate manner, but to the degree that they want to do that. They want the government rations, although government rations do not sound very fun to me. It sounds like MREs. They want government rations fine, given what our treaty situation is like, but I think that we should allow them to do that. And to not do so against their will, to me, is classical Anglo conformity.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know, because like I said, I think I wasn't thinking about, I grew up in a relatively multicultural area of New Jersey. We didn't have a lot of Black students, but we were about 40% Asian and South Asian Indian. So it was a very diverse school. And, we saw definitely a lot of racial prejudice where people have ideas about, white people this or Asian people that, the kind of like beliefs that people have, which I don't think any of that's ever going to 100% go away. As a Christian, I feel like we're sinful people. We make judgments about people. We should work on it, but it's not something that I think is going to ever 100% be eliminated from society. But it was one of these things where, and I live in the South now. I live in North Carolina. I don't think that word white supremacy has quite the level of like emotion attached to it from my upbringing, because it wasn't something that really got talked about a whole lot, or it felt like it was kind of like historical as opposed to something that's currently happening. So I think when I use that term to describe, the government coming in and changing different ethnicities' diets, or, making recommendations that are based on science that was done in white populations, or even white male populations, it tends to be very much where the nutrition research is coming from, that then gets told to women and children and, Black people, Hispanic people, that kind of thing, telling them to eat this way. It actually isn't appropriate for their physiology, and it's causing harm to their health. So that was why I used that term. And it interestingly received as far as some people thought it was accurate, some people thought it wasn't. So that's why I wanted to get your perspective.
Well, that's a very interesting point because, we know that, for example, we know that alcohol has a disparate impact on Native Americans in a way it doesn't with whites. So, yeah, we don't think about the fact that because of their genetic background that they really could have different needs, at least at the margins than other groups. And so that's something that I think is really worth thinking about.
Yeah, and a lot of my perspective also comes from having lived in Australia for a while and seeing the way that the Aboriginal population there had so many health challenges, and the, life expectancy difference between an Aboriginal Australian and a white Australian, I think is like 20 or 30 years or something, which is kind of crazy to me that that's even remotely acceptable. And just coming from the perspective that the way that a lot of these cultures would have been eating their natural diets, that is the way that I believe that they should be allowed to eat and should be taught again, because of the white culture coming in and changing their diet to one that's more processed, more, carbs, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, I think the Western diet being pushed on these cultures is causing more harm to them than it causes even to the white population. That, sugar is not great for people to be eating, that kind of thing. But I tend to have kind of some strong opinions about, public health and nutrition and that kind of thing. And they don't always rub people the right way. But I like getting your perspective on the white supremacy comment, because, again, my thought is that if we really care as a culture about everybody's health, then we need to look at, how does somebody's ethnicity affect their needs when it comes to health, their needs when it comes to diet. And, are we doing an effective job of that? Or are we believing that what we've learned from the study of white bodies or white male bodies typically, is that good enough to then apply that to everybody? So like I said, kind of more of a thought experiment than actually something that I think is super well researched. But before I get off on too much of a tangent, I would love to chat with you about the concepts that you brought up in your book. The book that I'm speaking about is the Beyond Racial Gridlock book, which am I correct in saying that you published that in 2006?
Yes.
So it was funny because I saw somebody recommend that as a really great book to read in this climate where everyone's saying that we should be learning about anti-racism and educating ourselves. And there's been some concerns about some of the recommendations about books and documentaries and things to consume, and, making sure that we're not just seeing one side of the perspective. So what I loved about your book is that you look at the different major forms of secular approaches to racism. And I would love if we could just kind of scratch the surface of that. I'm definitely going to recommend people read your book, but if we could just scratch the surface of the four main secular approaches that you mention in that book and the basic pros and cons of each.
Sure. The four models that I identify as color blindness, anti-conformity, multiculturalism, and white responsibility. And honestly, if I was writing a book today, I'd probably call white responsibility anti-racism. So it wasn't a big term back then. And I couldn't even figure out a good term. I actually, a little aside here, I actually had, I was going to call it the white is evil model. And then people said, no, that's just way too negative. Don't do that. Don't do that. And so I'm glad I went with white responsibility. Colorblindness is what it says. Let's just ignore race. Let's just pretend everyone's, let's just say everyone's the same, everyone's equal. Let's just ignore race and bringing up race is a problem. The people who are problematic are the ones who bring up racial issues. And it has a certain nobility of goal, which I don't, which I don't ignore. It can correct some overcorrections we find in the other models, but of course, it's hard to ignore race when the impact that I talked about in the studies I've talked about, and we have people who've been traumatized by race. It's hard to just say, just go away. And so it's problematic in that way. And conformity is the model where we tell people of color, hey, you want to succeed, become more like whites, educationally, culturally, these sort of things. Learn how to see this way, and as you succeed economically, we'll have better race relations. And there's some studies that show that economic parity does improve race relations. And to be honest, there are things that people of color can learn from whites in order to succeed in this particular society at this particular time. But of course, the downside is, it's really denigrating to cultures of color. I mean, it's really sort of saying that, your culture is inferior. And it doesn't take into consideration there's alternate ways in which you could succeed, such as what Asian Americans are doing. They don't have this sort of individualistic that European Americans have. They have a communal type of way, but they've done pretty well. Multiculturalism is a respect for different cultures. It's a respect to say that, all cultures are, sorry, that's my phone, that all cultures are, should be honored and valued, and it should be uplifted, and to sort of, and actually it's a reaction to conformity. And I think the strengths of multiculturalism is pretty self-evident, that we have denigrated certain cultures. I mean, you give a good example with Native Americans and the history of that and why that is. It can be problematic because the way multiculturalism is, in theory, all cultures are saying, hey, we value all cultures. The reality is, a lot of times the way multiculturalists actually express it is sort of denigrating the majority culture and uplifting unnecessarily sometimes of the minority cultures. And I've seen presentations where we bring out a problem in my own culture. Is that African Americans, it's what they call oppositional culture. So we don't do as well educationally because we see education as part of, what whites do. Well, the problem is if you don't do well educationally, it has all sorts of ramifications on down the line. And so, some of the ways multiculturalism has been expressed really sometimes can actually hurt us. And then, you ultimately also go just philosophically to the whole notion, do we really want to uplift all cultures? I mean, would that include Nazi Germany? In theory, don't we at some point have to say what this culture is doing is wrong? Female genital mutilation. Are there things that we should say? No, your culture should not do that. And then there is white responsibility, which today I'll call anti-racism, which takes very seriously racism, takes very seriously the advantages whites have gained, and to correct those advantages. And those are all good things. The issue, though, I bring in, was a variety of issues I bring in. One, I do think that anti-racism, the way it's practiced today, is dehumanizing to majority group members. And we can go into that if you wish. But I mean, I think the way it's done today is dehumanizing. And research shows that when you are trying to work things out, you dehumanize one group at the expense of another group, then you just have this sort of fighting that's all the time happening. I think it allows the play of the race card, which the way I define that is, you could say if there's a problem that's due to racism, whether it is or is not. I think in the book I give the example of a congressman who was with a 16-year-old, and then he said, well, this is due to racism. This is what's happening. But all the evidence was he was with a 16-year-old. And so, so that's a problem as well, that, I think that whites have a right to be fearful if we give total power to people of color, just as people of color have a right to be fearful when whites have total power, because we tend to abuse those powers. And so those are the four models I go into. They all bring certain insights and strengths to them, but they all, I think, have very, very troublesome downfalls.
You said anti-racism is the new way that you would describe it, but it was the white responsibility model. Do you get the impression that that's like the main narrative that we're hearing now, or is there other ones that you feel like we're hearing?
I think it's the main narrative that we're hearing in the dominant culture today. Yeah, I mean, I think there's pushback now, which I expected, and I think there's a pushback to our head towards either towards colorblindness or inconformity. But yeah, I think it is the main narrative that people have today.
Mm-hmm. And for those of us who are wanting to educate ourselves and to learn more and to, just open ourselves up to other perspectives, do you feel like the resources that come from, oh my gosh, critical race theory, is that the name of the general perspective? Do you feel like those resources are things that are valuable for white people like me to read? Or do you think it could be something that actually creates polarizing beliefs that are not helpful?
I think it's valuable to read across the spectrum. So I would say, yes, it's valuable to read that. I don't think it's valuable to accept it without being critical of it, without thinking about it, without being willing to critique it. And that's why I fear some people do. But yeah, of course we want to read. And if someone's going to critique something like critical race theory, then you got to at least read what it's about and not just hear from, your uncle what he thought about it or your grandmother what she thought about it. You actually have to read at least people who are sympathetic to it, their descriptions of the books. You may not have to read all the books because I know there's a lot of books out there now. But you at least read people who are sympathetic to it so you understand what the arguments are. And then, you can come to your own conclusions. Do I think that there are things that critical race theory offer that are valuable? Yes. Do I have problems with it? Yes. So I don't have a problem, with people reading it and critiquing it or reading it, just for the sake of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I feel like at least in our current climate with everything that's been going on in the last 2 months, the idea of reading it with a critical eye seems like that's not what's being encouraged. It's like, read this. This is
one of the problems of it. The number one book has been White Fragility. I don't know if you've read it or I'm sure you've heard the concept.
I bought it on Amazon because everyone's like, you should read this. And then I started to see some critique of it. And I was like, I don't know. Do I want to read this? I'm not sure if this is going to be valuable. That's why I bought your book.
What I would say is, beyond, and there's some academic weaknesses of the book that I won't go into. But beyond that, if I'm a white person, what I hear from that book is that I only have one acceptable response to people of color, and that is to listen and obey. That's problematic. That's very problematic. It's the assumption that people of color cannot, mislead you. Some of the things that I've seen done in response to white fragility, some of the way people of color treated whites, I would call that verbally abusive. And yet whites are not supposed to cry. They're not supposed to be mad. They're not supposed to walk away. They're not supposed to do anything but listen and obey. I know that is not going to be a solution. And let me tell you something else. The way that people who follow white fragility, group white people, it's either, you have fragility or you don't. So it's this sort of dichotomous. Either you're with us 100% or you're all the way out. There's a group of whites in the middle. I don't know how big it is. I've not seen your research. There's a group of whites who, they're not the type who are saying, oh, all this race stuff is a bunch of hooey. I don't want anything to do with it. Colorblindness. And they're not the ones who are engaging in listening and obeying. They're the ones who actually see racial problems and they actually want something done. But they sense this is not the solution. They sense this is not the answer. And they've been called racist one time too many. They've been verbally abused one time too many. And so they don't want to have anything to do with white fragility. But on the other hand, they don't want to ignore the racial problems either. And the way white fragility coins everything and throws all whites who don't buy into it into the same bucket just does not comport to reality and really cuts off people who might be willing to work with them on issues if they felt that if they felt there's a way forward beyond just shutting up and obeying. And so, the problem, one of the problems with critical race theory is it does not, in theory, allow itself to be critiqued. And knowing what we know about humans, when we know we can't be critiqued, we don't tend to act our best. Let's just say that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that makes our country awesome, even though it has its problems. Being able to openly criticize things that you don't agree with is a freedom that I think a lot of other countries don't have. And I think that's what makes our country great, is that we can share critique. Obviously, there's a difference between attacking someone versus critiquing, but just being able to disagree, I think, is something that in the last couple of months or so has gotten a little lost as far as the art of respectfully disagreeing. And it's interesting because the post that I was mentioning before about me mentioning that there was white supremacy in the dietary guidelines, in the way that, we've implemented those dietary guidelines, and seeing the bubbling up of people that were very angry about that, people that were very supportive of that. There was a discussion happening in the comments where one of my colleagues, who's a Black dietitian, I wanted to get her opinion on some something I was discussing with a white colleague, and we were having this conversation. And Facebook comment discussions are always a little, it's always questionable if that's the best place to have a conversation. But we were kind of discussing that term and was that appropriate? And like, why did I use that term? And I had tagged her in the comment and said, hey, could you give your perspective as a non-white person? Because I don't want this to just be a conversation with white people talking to white people about like what we think is appropriate. And she appropriately responded and said that her experience was not as an other, and that me using that term non-white was saying that like your experience is contrasting to the white experience. And that when she said that, I thought about it and I was like, you know what? She's right. I shouldn't say that word. That's not a word that I should be using. I shouldn't be referring to people as non-white, even though in my mind, I was just thinking, oh, I don't want it to just be white people. I want some people that are not white to chime in as well. So I think one thing that I've learned consuming, or at least like observing some of the anti-racism content, even though I do agree that it does go very far in a direction of making it that white people are, wrong about everything. I feel like I've learned that, hey, I could have said something that even though I did not intend it as racist, it could be interpreted as racist. And if a Black or person of color says that it feels racist to them, I can say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't, I won't say that again. And I apologize for that comment. And you're right. And I think that was something that, if anything with the anti-racism whole, movement that's been happening right now, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater when I see some of the stuff that's going on. But it was something that I'm like, okay, that's a respectful way to respond. Even if I did not intend something, I can see that that was the impact and I can apologize for it and I can commit to doing better. So that's how I'm trying to navigate this whole situation. And unfortunately, it kind of feels like you said right now that if somebody criticizes the white fragility philosophy, that person is racist in some way or ignorant or, whatever people want to say about it. So that's one of the things I really liked about your book is that, again, you were pointing out there's a lot of great stuff that comes from that. And there's some stuff that is not good that's coming from it that I think, you wrote it in 2006. In 2020, it's very relevant to some of the kind of things that are happening right now. So
I waited 14 years for this book to hit.
Are you getting a lot of sales lately?
Actually, my sales have gone up. It was, they don't send me notices. I don't know if you've written a book.
I have not.
They don't send me notices, but I'm looking at Amazon, I'm seeing how the sales, I was like, wow. Yeah. So it took 14 years, but finally I've made it.
Yes. Well, hopefully you'll get some more sales out of this conversation. I can't promise anything. I don't have a massive audience, but who knows? Maybe we'll go viral. So in your book, you suggest what you call a mutual responsibility approach to racism. Can you explain what that means and what that looks like practically I think most of my listeners are probably white. So even just for a white person, how to approach racism with a mutual responsibility mindset.
Yeah. So, as a Christian, I was thinking, is there something distinctive about my Christian faith that speaks to racial issues? And, this is my thinking, 15 years ago. And the thing I decided that really made Christianity in this particular issue distinct was the whole notion of human depravity. Now, I won't go all into it, but human depravity is something that's not fully accepted among certain humanistic progressive groups where a lot of this discussion lies. But basically, human depravity is that we're fallen creatures, that we all fall short. And if that's true, then all of us fall short, and whatever solutions we're going to offer is going to be, to some degree, selfish, something that's going to serve us as opposed to others. As an African American, I'm probably, if I was just talking about, I have total power, I can offer any solution I want, I'm going to offer a solution that's best for me and my people, not necessarily best for the whole society. And so the way to correct that is to be in dialogue with one another. And one of the problems with all these models is the lack of dialogue. It's the model says, here's a solution, boom, without recognizing this solution serves certain people, but not other people. And so mutual responsibility is about how do we enter into that dialogue? in a respectful way, not in the way that we see today on NBC or Fox or anything like that, but a respectful dialogue where we try to actually listen to one another. What you did with your friend was you listened to her and you responded. And to some degree, CRT gets it half right. They get it right that whites should listen to people of color. Where they get it wrong is they don't say the reverse is true, because once again, CRT is designed for certain people, but not all people. And so if we can listen and work out solutions, and here's what I would say to people of all sides. You can figure out everything you want, get a 100% solution, try to get political power and impose it on people. And you're guaranteeing an opposition when you do that, because the people who don't benefit are going to say, well, we had no say. Why should we work to help your solution succeed? We're going to sabotage you. And they will. Or you can work with people and maybe get 70%, 80% of what you want. And now when you begin to implement it, you have people across the spectrum working together. That's what we're lacking. And you can take whatever you want to look at today, whether it's calls to abolish the police or tear down statues or on the other side, calls for people just ignore race and that sort of stuff. However you want to look at that, because there's no communication and it's just we're trying to impose their will. The resistance is going to be there, and you don't have people working together. But I think that the solution is in a collaboration with one another to find solutions that we can all agree with, what I call win-win solutions rather than win-lose solutions. So we move forward together. And my fear is, as long as we focus in on making sure that we win and win-lose solutions, that we are going to continue to have racial alienation. Some groups are going to win one day and lose the next day, and so forth and so on. Maybe one day one group will become so powerful they can impose their will on others, but then they'll be fighting the others the rest of all eternity. Until we learn how to work together, then we are sort of doomed to this. And I'll just say one last thing. This is a solution that I developed from my beliefs as a Christian. But research validates the solution too. Research in contact hypothesis, shows the solution. Research showing how collaborative communications help to create, better solutions. Research on how if we create a common identity, we lose less bias. There's also some research out there that support these arguments as well. And so I actually wrote another book, an academic book on this, where I don't use scripture at all. Where I just use sociological theories and studies to make the same argument. Because I believe that science and good Christianity go together. And I think this is the case where that is true.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that you said that, because I think even in my background in nutrition and the kind of, groups that I've been involved in the nutrition space, a lot of times people see Christianity as being anti-science. And if you start talking about faith we can talk a little bit about this too, because I think this is probably a little bit more of your focus. Maybe you've been brought back into the race conversation more in the last couple of months, but I know you've been thinking or actually doing more research on religious bias and anti-Christian attitudes. It's almost like if you start using Christian values or using Christian beliefs as a reason for making a suggestion or a certain solution, that is somehow bigoted and harmful and, not acceptable in society these days. So what's your thoughts about that? Because I think one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because you have that Christian faith, the strong faith piece, and as a Black man, having done all this research on race, like you have a very interesting perspective. And I feel like right now my experience has been that in the anti-racism, Black Lives Matter type of movement, it feels very anti-Christian to me. And maybe I'm just interpreting it incorrectly or misunderstanding it, but a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing, and of course, the media is not going to show us the good stuff, right? They're only going to show us the conflict. But in a lot of the conflict that I'm seeing, it seems like more of that anti-Christian attitude is being brought up almost because like they're conflating Christianity with white supremacy. So do you have any thoughts about how that anti-Christian attitude is showing up in the racism conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've actually thought a little bit about this, but not enough to really have good concrete examples. I think that there are a certain group of individuals who like Black Lives Matter because they think that they're anti-Christian. I don't know if that makes much sense, but I think that the image of Christians, as far as being very white and such, and then you have Black Lives Matter, and so they figure Christians don't like Black Lives Matter, and so they like Black Lives Matter for that very reason. So I do think that there are a group of people that are like that. I'm toying around with a little bit of research that might tease that out, but I haven't gone far enough to really make a strong commitment towards that. So my critique of Black Lives Matter has not been on some of the things that other people brought out as far as, some of the morals on sexuality and things like that. My critique of Black Lives Matter has been their approach towards racial issues. But I have been to their website, and I can see where some people would come to the conclusion that this is not a group that is very supportive of Christians. I know there's a church that they've been protesting out there, and some of the damage the churches one suspects may have some Christianophobic elements to it. And so I think it's worth a question worth addressing. I think we need more research before we can fully address that question. And so I may do some of that research, I don't know, but it is something that I've sort of toyed with a little bit.
Yeah, and the argument that I've seen about that organization particularly is the idea that in their website and their mission statement, there's Marxism type beliefs. And if you look at Marxism as a philosophy, it's anti-religion in general, not just Christianity, but certainly Christianity is a target. Right. And then it's also anti-capitalism, which as a Christian entrepreneur,
anti-capitalism.
I was going to say, as a Christian,
the whole purpose of Marx, hey, capitalism is bad.
Right. And so that's always been one of my challenges, or I shouldn't say always, in the last 2 months with this whole movement of Black Lives Matter. Of course, I agree with the statement. Like, the statement is not the problem in my mind. Yeah. For me, the organization, if it does have a Marxism agenda, and I've seen some people, sharing stuff, hashtagging Black Lives Matter, but saying like burn down capitalism, or, like white Christians are the problem, that kind of thing. And as a Christian entrepreneur, like, my faith and my ability to freely pursue, the business that I'm developing and economics and that kind of thing, I just can't get on board with any movement that's going to tell me that I can't worship God and I can't, work towards financial prosperity because of the work that I'm doing. So has that been something that you've seen anything about?
Well, all right. I've not really looked at the members of Black Lives Matters per se for their own anti-race. I've not looked for their statements. I will say that clearly Marxism is anti-capitalist. I mean, that's the whole purpose of Marx. But it's not necessarily, Marx himself is anti-religious, but I don't know if you know much about liberation theology, which is a mixture of Christianity and Marxism. So it is possible to be a Marxist and a Christian, to not have that as far as your not have capitalism as your economic system, but you're still a Christian. So that's possible. So that by itself, to me, does not make them anti-Christian. The fact that they're Marxist does not by itself make them anti-Christian. Fully acknowledging that probably if you're a Marxist, you're probably more likely to be anti-Christian if you're not a Marxist. But that, there are people who do mix the two between. So, but once again, I've not really looked deeply at the individuals per se. So I can't say that as a group that they are. Would it surprise me if it comes out that they really have this deep-seated hatred of Christianity? It would not surprise me at all.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I didn't know that there were groups that combined Christianity with Marxism specifically. I could understand like communism, socialism kind of mindset, but Marxism, I always got the impression that version of, socialism or communism is anti-religion, but that's never heard of that one before. And so I know that right now, so you have a book that I have not read yet, but I'll have to get this one. So Many Christians, So Few Lions. And you're looking at I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right. Christianophobia. Is that how you would pronounce that? Yeah. So anti-Christian attitudes, anti-Christian hostility. And I was looking at one of your blog posts that was talking, and I might have misinterpreted this. So it's, I might be incorrect in saying that up until this point, persecution of Christianity in the United States has not been anything remotely close to the way it is in a lot of other countries. What are you seeing in the last couple of months with the anti-Christian attitudes? Is it something that you feel like is getting worse, or is it the same as it's always been?
Yeah, I think we're clearly living in a post-Christian world at this point. I've been talking about moving into one. I think we are in one at this point culturally. And so do I think that Christians face discrimination in certain elements of our society? Yes, I do. Do I think that being a Christian can be an advantage in certain ways? Yes, it can be. And so it's sort of like, well, I'll put it this way. People who tend to have Christianophobia tend to be white, male, wealthy, highly educated. As sociologists, those are all markers of status and power. So even though they are, they're not a majority of the country, they tend to have more power. The number of people with Christianophobia probably matches the number of people with Islamophobia in our country today. And so, if Islamophobia is a problem, and then you have a group of people who are even more powerful because people with Islamophobia tend to be white and male, but don't tend to be very wealthy, have a high education, then that means it's a serious problem. We can go through examples of situations where I think Christianophobia had an impact on this person. There's my research in academia, which illustrates that academics are less willing to hire a person if they're considered a Christian. I've done a book on the media that shows that the media, given the same story, and you put a Muslim and a Christian, they write different stories. So the story we used was a church or a mosque shooting. The mosque shooting was about hate crime. The church shooting was about, we have too many guns. So there is evidence that is very real in our society, even though I don't say it rises to the level of persecution, because I think that comes with certain connotations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can definitely get the impression that semantics is important for you, and you don't want to use words that are, describing something with hyperbole, because there is a lot of actual persecution where people are getting killed in other countries. I don't think someone's necessarily getting targeted for, assassination based on them being Christian, except for, like you said, in the church shooting, you could argue that may have been motivated by their faith.
Yeah, there are people who go engage and kill people for reasons like that. We don't call that persecution. We call it persecution from the state doing. So the state starts hiring people to go in church to shoot them up. Then I'm going to say, this is persecution. But yeah, and honestly, I think I did a blog not too long ago where it was one of those things where I had this great idea. I was going to go and I was going to show, this is not persecution. So I actually looked up the definition of persecution. And when I looked at the definition, it actually said something like harass. And then I said, well, technically, yeah, that is what happens. I still don't like to use that term because it has certain connotation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, when I was arguing about the white supremacy thing, I looked up the word supremacy to say, well, what does the word supremacy mean? Am I misinterpreting this? And the definition said something about like the belief in your superiority. And I'm like, well, I feel like if you're telling someone that the way you do things is better than them, that's like a supremacy thing, right? So but the historical context of the term affects, the actual interpretation when you're using it in conversation. And it's interesting because a couple years ago in my business, I started to be a lot more vocal about my faith beliefs, and the initial reaction, yes, I got a lot of people that were super excited that I was talking about it, but I had some really pretty hateful responses, people saying that they used to think I was smart and they can't believe that, and I must be anti-science, and, they're never going to follow me again. And they they think I've lost all credibility. And that's just from learning that I was a Christian. Do you see that happening in the academic world where people feel like if they're open about their faith that they get treated differently, or people think that they're not as intelligent in the academic world?
Yeah, there's evidence that academics assume that you're a Christian, a Christian, that you can't critically think, that you're not that as intelligent and that sort of thing. I've seen people say stuff like Christians should not be scientists and things of this nature. The anti-science part is always interesting to me. because you can find any group and they become anti-science when science impedes on them. So there are issues in which Christians do act in anti-intellectual ways. There's no doubt about that. But then you could go to like the anti-vaxxers, people who don't want to get vaccinated because they think vaccination is going to create this. And those tend to be more on the left than the right. And so, you can look at that. I would argue you could look at even during the whole COVID thing, that at one point protesting was going to create, people were saying, you can't protest because you're going to create more infections. The nature of protest change, forget all that. To me, that's anti-science too. So I think the term anti-science is used too much, because what really happens is that people don't like what the science says, and then they start resisting it. And that's not unique to Christians. That's obviously something that you can see in a lot of other groups as well.
Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side, science doesn't know everything, right? Like there's a lot of things that haven't been studied, or things that are not lucrative so that they don't get funded for being studied. So to say that, well, there's no science to support that, I think sometimes people can say that means that it's wrong, as opposed to saying, hey, there's no science on that yet. Why don't we do some science on it to actually figure out what the answer on this is? So,
and science also has problems, looking how science is done is sort of like looking how sausages is made sometimes. And I can give you case studies of stuff where the science said one thing, and then when you look at it, you realize that it was too politicized. It was not what science have said it was. And so I'm a scientist. I believe in science, but I'm cautious, especially when I sense that certain findings are politically driven, to just accept them. And if it's in my field, then I would want to look at the research to see whether or not it was competently done.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I feel like, especially as certain things are being funded for research, there is a financial motivation for certain studies as well. So it ends up being like, and I'm not saying that means it's incorrect, but I think for people to say, well, the research says this, that must mean it's 100% true 100% of the time. I think that's where science can start to be used almost like a weapon. Like, well,
yes, it can be.
So what I would love to do to wrap things up, because like I said, I could probably talk to you for a really long time about a lot of stuff, because I feel like I don't get the opportunity to have these kind of conversations with people that are not in my immediate circle. So just being able to have you on and talk about this stuff's really cool. What I would love to wrap up with is just some thoughts from you about how a conservative Christian can help fight racism and racial injustice in a way that aligns with their faith and their core values. Just to, use the Black Lives Matter as an example. Personally, I do not support that organization. I will not donate money to that organization because of the things that I've seen in their philosophy and, some of the questions I have about where the money is going, that kind of thing. But of course, I will say the phrase Black Lives Matter because I believe that. Like, I agree with that sentiment. So for someone like me who feels a little bit lost, or kind of like, how do you navigate this without it seeming like, oh, you won't use the term Black Lives Matter, you're a racist, or, you don't support that organization, you're a racist. Like, how does someone like me, and I'm sure a lot of my listeners feel like this too, how do we actually work to dismantle racism in a way that does not force us to ignore our traditional conservative values?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. And I think we're in it for the long term because of the sort of mood of anti-racism that we see in our society today. It's not going to be easily changed, although I do think it's going to burn itself out. I think what we have to do is start practicing active listening and dialogue with people across the racial and political spectrum. And when I give talks, one way I like to end the talk is to give people an assignment. And that assignment is simply to take someone out to lunch or dinner or a beer or a Coke or a glass of wine or what have you. And someone of either a different race or different persuasion who thinks differently from you, and just engage in active listening. No argument, just actively listen. Get to the point to where you could reiterate what they believe in your terms in ways that go, yes, you know what I believe. And learn to have this practice of active listening. Because I think a community that begins to actively listen is one that's going to be able to begin to solve racial problems, find solutions that people can get behind, even though they don't get everything. And I think that we have to start practicing that now so that when the time comes and we need to listen to each other, we learn how to do that. That person you take to Coke or lunch or coffee may not want to know what you come from, and that's fine. Maybe in time, if you listen to them enough, they will, and then they can have to practice the act of listening. I think if we start teaching this and start spreading this more and more, once again, this is a long-term problem. I'm under no illusions that we start doing this and then tomorrow people go, hey, look at those Christians are doing. We should actually be listening too. But if we could start as a church doing that over a long period of time, I think we'll start making a difference. And in a post-Christian world, that could be very important, because if the church is doing something on race and they're not doing it outside the world and it's being effective, that gives us more legitimacy in the post-Christian world, in a world where people tend to dismiss Christianity. And so that would be my suggestion on how to approach it at this point, just a little at a time, because we're not going to change, we're not going to turn the Titanic on a dime.
Like even the first couple of days after George Floyd's death and all that stuff started really, going very extreme as far as how everybody was talking about it. As somebody who, I don't have like a giant Instagram following or something, but I do have like 18,000 followers on Instagram. And I was seeing a lot of the people in the community that have a lot of followers getting verbally attacked for not making a statement. Like they said something, or they put the black square on Instagram or something like that, and people were really angry that they weren't doing more. And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, wow, do people just like not, are we not allowed to like pause and like learn and listen before we speak? Like, everyone's expecting you to just come out with this like strong statement. And I think that's something that, fortunately I don't have such a large audience that I felt like I had to be doing anything. But it is something where I think we all as a society need to give people a little bit of space to like process stuff and to ask questions and to learn, and not to have to like react so quickly. Cause that's where I think we get into trouble. You react really fast and then you realize like, oh, I didn't have the whole picture, and I said something that now I don't think was accurate. Like, it's not the best. Unfortunately, social media, I think in general, is just like kind of making this a lot worse. But, expecting people to be able to say exactly what everyone wants them to hear. And then, even just in our society where you say one thing and this group agrees with you and they're like, oh, thanks for speaking up. This was amazing. And then this group says, you're awful. I can't believe you said that. Unfollow. So it's just kind of a weird culture that we live in now, where it's like, if you don't say something, you're wrong. If you do say something, some people think you're right. Some people think you're wrong. And it's just, I don't know. I try to not get too wrapped up in it. I think that's where the faith piece comes into play, where I'm like, all right, God, you know my heart, you know how I feel, you know what I'm doing. I don't have to prove to anyone that I'm not a racist by, taking a picture of the white fragility book and putting it on my Instagram or something. So, one last question. I know I said I was wrapping up with that, but it made me think of something. How would you suggest a conservative Christian responds when they see blatant anti-Christian rhetoric on things like social media or in the media, like the mainstream media, which I think we see a lot of it in certain, areas? I feel like Jesus would say, turn the other cheek, but I also wonder, like, at what point do we say something, right? Because we don't want it to turn into something where all of a sudden we're being oppressed and we're not allowed to go to church.
The way I think about it is, all right, sometimes that person's rude to me. And then, I decide, how I want to handle this. Do I want to just walk away? Do I want to turn the other cheek? Do I need to confront it? And I think all those are viable options. As a Christian, I think the first two ones I'm most likely to do. But if someone's rude to me and I suspect because I'm Black, then for me to turn away means that I'm giving them permission to be rude to people because they're Black. And therefore, I feel more, I'm not saying that it's something I need to do every single time, but I feel more of a compulsion to confront it at that point. And I think anti-Christian bias is that way. I think there are times where we should confront it, not just because, it hurts our feelings, but because this is setting a stage, setting a pattern that we want to get broken. And so I think that there is importance in doing something like that. But, we have to look at our own hearts and make sure that what we're doing is for the right reason. And so that's how, it's a balance. There's no cookie cutter right way to deal with every single situation. I feel because I've read on this topic that I have more responsibility to react as other people do, but even though I don't want to react every single time I see it, because that's all I would be doing. So I think you just have to weigh things, but there is turn the other cheek, which I think is something that we have to bring into our calculations. We also have to bring to our calculations, are we allowing an injustice to go on unconfronted?
Yeah, it's so tough. And I am definitely a person that can kind of talk first, listen later. So it's something that I'm working on. And my husband's the exact opposite. He's like, he'll say, why do you get involved in these conversations? Like, why do you just not ignore it? I'm like, because I can't just like let people say these kind of things and completely go unopposed and make it sound like this is acceptable to say these things about people. So like you said, there's no perfect response, but it's, I think as long as we're seeking God in our response and like taking that pause to say, okay, God, how would you have me respond to this? Should I say something? Should I not? Like, at what point is it, turning the other cheek versus like turning the tables over in the temple or whatever. So it's tough. And I think we're in a really interesting year where, we're kind of like, we have to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to like, okay, can I really act the way Jesus would act in this circumstance? And I hope that we'll all be better for it by the time all of this stuff hopefully settles down. Anyway, any last words or anything that you'd like to share before we wrap things up?
No, this has been very interesting. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, if our listeners want to learn more about your work or, just hear more about your perspective on these things, where can they find you?
Well, my website's georgeyancey.com, and I'm revitalizing it even as in the course of these past few days, so I'll have some more stuff up there. And there's that, and I work at Baylor, so if someone wants to look me up there, that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm. And then you have a blog.
Shattering Paradigms.
Awesome. And we'll link to all of those in the show notes, so if people want to check that out, they can find that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Yancey, for your time. It was a really great conversation. I know I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did too. And we will see you here next week on the Fed and Fearless podcast. Take care, everybody. Hey there, Laura here again. Thank you so much for listening to the Fed and Fearless podcast. Your time is your most precious resource, and I'm so grateful that you choose to spend some of it with me. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast and want to continue supporting my work on this show, I would very much appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes. By leaving a 5-star review, you'll help others find the show and help me spread my message to a larger audience. You can go to fedandfearless.com/review to find a button that'll take you right to iTunes to leave your review. And I have a special gift for you as a thank you for helping me share the podcast. Once you leave your review, send a screenshot of the review to hello@lauraschoenfeldrd.com. Or you can DM it to me on Instagram @lauraschoenfeldrd. Once you do, I'll share a free copy of my Overcoming Undereating ebook. Then share a favorite podcast episode in your Instagram stories and tag me @lauraschoenfeldrd. And I'll also give you a free copy of my 14-day calorie challenge recipe guide. Together, these bonuses are worth $44 and will help you become Fed and Fearless. And you'll get them absolutely free for just helping me grow the podcast. Again, thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you here next week for the latest episode.